We've already started, apparently.
You know what I'm thinking about?
No. Alexander, what are you thinking about?
I'm thinking about the past.
The past?
The past.
Like what you had for lunch yesterday?
No, I'm thinking a little bit further than that.
Day before yesterday?
No, keep going.
What are you thinking about?
I'm thinking about history. The far past, the distant past. Because you know what's cool about history?
It has loads of really cool stories.
It does have loads of really, really cool stories. A lot of interesting things have happened to humanity over the course of its existence. And there's a lot of stories in that history that one can take and insert as inspiration into their Dungeons & Dragons world. Isn't that right?
It's very true.
Yeah.
Very true.
And we, namely him, have actually done this quite a few times. Have we not? Have you not?
I have.
You have.
I have, now that you mention it, yes.
So what we wanted to do today is just go through some interesting aspects of your world that have been inspired by historical events.
Yes. Okay.
Talk about them a little bit. And then maybe say how history can influence you guys in coming up with some new things for your Dungeons & Dragons campaign.
That's okay. Let's
What do you think?
I think that's a great idea.
Fantastic. Shall we start? Oh, cue intro music now! First up today in our historical examination of Jim's Dungeons & Dragons campaign is the Varangian Guard.
Well,
Take it away, Jim.
Let's give some context.
Let's take the context.
We have to have some context. I worked in history for decades. As many of you know, I was an archaeologist prior to that. So my interest in the past has been... He doesn't like archaeologists because...
I don't dislike archaeologists.
Because he's not very smart.
I just think that they're...
Anyway, regardless, I was an archaeologist for a number of years, and then I worked in history for most of my professional career. So, history is going to have an influence in my game. It always has, because I've always had an interest in it. So that's the background of why I've inserted so much history into my game. Now, I've never taken actual historic events and just picked them up and dropped them into my campaign. I've never taken straight up historical settings like, I'm going to take, Constantinople and drop it into my campaign.
Yeah.
But an awful lot of my stuff is based on those settings and those time periods.
Yeah.
You mentioned the Varangian Guard, and I think that this is because it's one of the things that you enjoyed most.
I thought it was very
when
cool.
you came across it. Mm-hmm. And these were things that I had developed long before he was even born.
Yeah.
And so it was always it was always fun to play with him when he was younger, because it's fun to play with him now. But
because
it was fun
my eyes were still full of wonder.
They were full of wonder, and then when you would come across something and you would realize what the historic equivalent of my campaign was in that area, then it became really fascinating to you.
My joy has since left.
Varangian Guard. One of the things that I did very early on was introduce a version of the Varangian Guard into my campaign. I had always been fascinated with the idea that Vikings had gone down to protect and fight for the Byzantine Emperor back in the day. And so I thought that was such a neat concept. And if you've ever been to Istanbul, if you go to the Church of Hagia Sophia, which is now, I think it's been returned to being a mosque.
Yeah.
Fairly recently. But for a long time, it was more of a museum than anything else. But if you know where to look, you can go inside the Church of Hagia Sophia, which was built many, 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 many years ago, I think in the 500s. You can find on a balustrade carvings, runic carvings from a Viking who was most likely a member of the Varangian Guard there, and he had carved his name into the marble of the balustrade, and it says something like Halfdan was here or something like that. But the idea that somebody came that far down out of their normal running area would have been to work for an emperor and would have been hired by an emperor because they had such a reputation, to me that was really a cool thing. Mm-hmm. So I ended up taking this concept of a Varangian Guard, changed the name, and they ended up being a part of an empire that is completely sea-based. But the sea-based empire has a capital city, a place by the name of Boston. And in Boston, the people who keep the peace are this equivalent of the Varangian Guard. And to me, bringing in bringing in an outside force to police the locals it was kind of a no-brainer in a way, because it's always been fun to have the players go in and encounter these Varangian guards. That's not their name, but it's the same thing. To have them go in and meet these guards, it really throws them off because they're obviously not local, and it just makes people really wonder about how they're supposed to approach them, because they're dealing with someone who's culturally not of the area.
Yeah.
It's been fun to see how people react to it.
Yeah, it's just a cool detail that when I first found them, it was kind of a very, this is a new sort of spice that's been injected into everything that's going on here. And now we have to think about things a little bit differently and take a different stock of the situation.
Well, and one of the things that I think that, one of the weaknesses of this, though, is that if somebody knows about the Varangian Guard...
That's true.
You have some insight into why I put them there in the first place. So that could be a good thing,
but...
or it can be a bad thing.
If you are a good player, you will not let your outside influence and understanding of certain things and those connections you make as a person influence how the character reacts.
Very true. And I will also throw in something out of left field just in case somebody tries to do that.
Yeah, he'll just kill you.
Not necessarily.
Well,
it has been known to happen. But because of the Varangian Guard, I've always had a fascination with the Vikings. And
the Danes and Norwegians.
Yes. Well, yeah, primarily Danes and Norwegians. But I've always had a fascination with their ability to trade and the ships that they built, and having a specialty ship that was built that they could build that could handle coastal waters and river waters, and the expansive trade that they managed to do because of that. And so I really, very early on, I wanted to have a culture that was based on that same seaborne trade empire where they had certain technologies that were very proprietary, where they were very protective of other people not learning how to build these types of ships. And so that Viking influence, that Viking concept, or the concept of the Vikings as a culture, that played a really heavy role in the development of the Sea Rover Empire, which it's entirely sea-based. And it's really not something that if you come across a group of them on land, they're very tough fighters, but the place that you really need to fear them is at sea.
Yeah. Again, it's fun while one will probably spend most of their time on land, it's nice to have some other aspects of things that, again, your character needs to build some knowledge base about the world in which they are in order to prepare for something like going on an ocean voyage. Because if you know that these people are out there, it helps you to not be just completely shocked when it happens. It's just preparation is important. We always say that in pretty much every aspect of the game, but that includes understanding the cultures of the area that you are.
Very good example of this. Way back, this is going back to the 1980s, very early 1980s. We had a campaign that we ran where, I'm not going to get into the details of the campaign because it was very complex. There was a lot of things going on where people were trying to make alliances to stop an attack on a country. And the alliances were few and far between. The areas where the places, people you could make an alliance with were very few and far between. But there was one of the cultures that I based on the Mongols, which they inhabit a steppeland area that is in the north of the primary continent that the players are usually find themselves on. The Mongols, I took the entire concept of the horse culture and the veneration of horses, and I dropped it into this steppe area. And it was fascinating to see, and going to my friend John, who was a sponsor of one of our recent videos, Mighty DK on Raw sponsorship. John is very good at finding out about doing research prior to going and having his character do anything. I'm not talking about researching at the local library. I'm talking research in-game. And John went out of his way to learn all there was to learn about this Mongol-based culture that I had placed into their steppelands, and what they valued as a culture and what might sway them to form an alliance to help him against this invading army. Again, I won't get into the details with it, but it was a really good example of how to successfully manipulate a situation and a historic setting in my campaign by going out and finding out what that culture valued and then coming up with ideas as to how to ingratiate himself into their good graces so that they'd be more than willing to help him fight against a common enemy.
And things like that just add a dose of realism into the campaign, into the story that you're helping to craft. It's not necessarily always going to be you paying gold for a bunch of people to come and fight for you, or you just having you going by yourself to fight a bunch of people.
Right.
There are other ways you can go about it, just like humans have done basically all throughout the course of their existence. Like the Romans created very close bonds with people who would be considered barbarians because they were really good fighters. It's just little things like that that have always happened, and if you can think about the game in the same way that people have thought about life and warfare, anything like that historically, it makes the game a lot more interesting to play because it broadens the sense of possibilities that you have to solve different problems.
I think that's key. It broadens the sense of it broadens the possibilities that are out there to solve problems. And that's one of the things, again, that my friend John is very good at, is looking at a situation and saying, if we go against these people head on, we're going to lose. We need to find another way to deal with the situation. And this situation, this time that he went and went after this Mongol culture to see if he could get them to join him was a really fun time for us to play.
It's creative problem solving.
Yeah, that really is.
Yeah.
Another area that I've taken concepts and ideas from is Native American culture.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying Native American culture as in I've taken, spiritual beliefs and things like that. That's not the case, but it's more of a hunter-gatherer in high plains and forest areas idea that I have applied to a lot of my wild elves. And the way that I have different groups of elves. I have high elves who are more, I don't want to use the term civilized, but they are
Rivendell.
more, exactly, think that. But then I also have wild elves who have a totally different approach to life and a totally different approach to who they work with, who they don't work with, who they fear, who they don't fear, and that has worked really well in my world, especially when players have encountered the wild elves after encountering the high elves, the Rivendell elves, if you will, because it gives, again, it's a completely different cultural approach to life and problem solving within the game for those non-player characters. It's fun to watch the player characters try and come to an understanding of what that might be and how they can work themselves into dealing with that non-player character culture.
Well, and it's interesting to have the different dynamics because, like you said, if you do encounter different groups of elves at different times, you have to take into account where they're from, what their backstory is, and how that, again, it's going to change how you interact with them, just like it changes how you interact with anybody from a different part of the world, like he was mentioning earlier with the Mongol Empire inspired people with the horses. It just adds something new. Not everything's going to be uniform. Like in Lord of the Rings, I would say the elves are pretty uniform in terms of their behavior. Where they live changes, and some of like how their buildings look and are described change, but there's no substantive difference between how they behave from place to place. And having these very substantive differences, even within broader races like elves or dwarves or anything else, it just makes the game more interesting.
It does, at least for us. And and I will throw in that I also when I'm integrating these cultural concepts or these cultural tropes, if you will, and changing them into what I want to have in my game. A lot of it is geography based and climate based.
Yeah.
So, it's not just a random thing where I sprinkle them down. I try to make logical sense of why that particular culture would have evolved in that space.
Yeah.
And I think that, as you have gone through, you've started to understand, since, when you were really young and playing, you've started to understand that, in this type of an environment, the people are probably going to be exploiting this as their food source or whatever. And when you start to see that, and then you start to see how, again, maybe it's become a hunter-gatherer culture because of the environment. Maybe it's become more of an industry-based situation because of the environment. Seeing that and recognizing that and understanding that helps you a lot when you come to a brand new area of my world because you've only seen a tiny portion of it. Yeah. It helps you to better be able to deal with new encounters.
And a lot of the things
to have that structure there.
Yeah, and a lot of the things that we're talking about here, the way that we play the game is very high fantasy oriented. Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily like there is a lot of dungeon crawling and lower, smaller adventures, but a lot of the characters that we've had and a lot of the characters that he's had historically have done very big, very world altering things. And these kind of influences, these historical influences on culture, society, all of that, that's where that really comes to play a significant role,
Yes.
is on these broader stories that are being told. Not necessarily on the small stuff, though it can.
It can.
But it's really on these really big world-changing events, these world-changing campaigns.
Or I'm going to have to change that. I understand what you're saying,
Yeah.
because your worldview of my world is very small.
Yeah, from a player
it's more
perspective.
regional.
Yeah.
But regional in a big way, like continental wide, not totally worldwide.
Yeah.
But regionally and continental wide. You're right.
Yeah.
100% right. I've long had a fascination with ancient Egypt, and there are a number of areas where the large building concepts, the monumental architecture of ancient Egypt, there are some places where that plays a role. And in some of those, I've actually used a lot of modules to flesh that out. I never used to use modules. For those of you who've watched the channel, you know that modules were anathema to me. But in recent years, I've realized that I'm never going to get as much detail into my world as I want before I die. So I've actually taken some of the Egyptian-based modules and placed them into the Egyptian areas. It still follows my concepts, and it's still the overall fleshing out of it is mine. But I do have a lot of Egyptian modules that I have dropped into the Egyptian area in my world, which you have never been to.
I've never made it there, but I do feel like this is a good moment to inject into the conversations the Egyptians did build the pyramids. That's all I have to say.
Yes.
Yes.
I'm with you on that.
Yes. Please continue.
I have an area of my world that is very heavily influenced by Japanese culture, and again, I'm not picking up true historical Japanese culture and dropping it into my world, but I do use Oriental Adventures in a very large area of my world, because medieval Japanese history fascinates me, and I wanted to make sure that I had somewhere in my campaign that had that feel to it.
Yeah.
And so there is an area that has a very heavy Japanese cultural feel in my campaign.
Yeah. It's very... Sorry, continue.
And again, it's taken straight out of Oriental Adventures that came out back in the 80s.
That was one of the last ones published. But yeah, we haven't done a video going through Oriental Adventures.
We have not, and we should.
Yet. I think that's actually the last one that we have.
That
one
we
of the
haven't
last
done.
ones. Yeah, aside from some of the monsters. So if you guys want to see that, let us know, and we might go through that one as well, the same way we've gone through some of the other books.
Because it's a really cool book.
Yeah. It's very creative.
It's very creative. There have been some people who have had some issues with it in recent years. Personally, I don't see it. I think it's actually more of an homage to Asian culture than it is something that denigrates it. I think that it actually builds it up and makes it very interesting. And the thing that I always like about that type of thing, we talked about it with deities and demigods, the thing that I liked about so many of those early D&D books is that they were never trying to be the be-all, end-all of the exploration of a culture.
Yeah.
But I can't tell you how many hours I spent investigating those cultures further just based
Strictly
on what I
because
saw in books put out by TSR.
they mentioned the Babylonians and deities and demigods, whatever it may have been.
Right. One of the other ones that you have never encountered, again, and very few people have gotten to this part of my world, I picked up the conflict, the conflict that took place around the Punic Wars. So Rome versus Carthage. And there's a huge section of my world that the Punic Wars, for lack of a better term, are still taking place today. Rome versus Carthage. And if you go there, it's a very highly developed society that is in constant warfare, which makes a really interesting location for adventuring, because there are civilizations that precede them. I won't say they were related to the Etruscans or anything like that. I'm not going to go there. But there are civilizations which precede this current Rome-like, Carthage-like civilization that exists, that is in a constant state of conflict.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping that you guys get there at some point, because there's an awful lot of really cool stuff going on, especially in the area of politics.
See, and that's something that I love in all fantasy. I think that would be a really cool place to be able to go. And the whole Punic Wars history is fascinating. There's so much going on. Think Hannibal in the mountains with the elephants. There's a lot of cool stuff that happened there. And just story-wise, there's some really interesting things you can take from that.
Yeah.
And I think that leads me into the big overarching point that I would like to make, which is that if you look at fantasy, there's always things that you can take directly from history as inspiration for what you do in your world. Game of Thrones is basically, there are things you can take from that have happened very similarly in real life, just minus the dragons. There's almost no magic in those books or in that show. So it's really just kind of a fake version of human history with some dragons sprinkled in.
Well, and a really good example of that is Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
Where Tolkien, he was a Saxon scholar.
Yeah, that's what he did for a living.
And so when you look at, especially the Rohirrim, you're looking at the Saxons. And to me, that is really fascinating, the iconography. And I think that was one of the things that was done really well in the movies, was the presentation
Capturing
of this Saxon
look.
horse lord type thing. To me, that was really a neat thing, a neat area that... what was his name? The director, Peter
Jackson.
Peter Jackson. I think he did an excellent job in set design and costume design in Lord of the Rings by taking that Saxon culture and sprinkling it into the Rohirrim. But it was there it was there with Tolkien. So
yeah. There's so many stories throughout human history in every corner of the world that are so interesting and so cool to go through and read about, that are, if nothing else, entertaining. You can look at them strictly as entertainment. And there's a lot of places you can get inspiration.
I've even got an area of my world, which you have been to just briefly. I have an area of my world that is based on indigenous culture in the Amazon basin.
I have been there.
You have been there.
Just briefly.
But
I
again,
accidentally killed someone there.
Yes, you did.
I felt bad.
Some other people killed someone there that they shouldn't have killed. But it just goes to show you that, and to me, it's a fascinating place. It was
cool.
really a lot of
really
fun
neat
to develop that area. But the inspiration for it, again, was indigenous culture in the Amazon rainforest.
Yeah.
So there are no end of, like Alexander was saying, there is no end of inspiration that you can take from human history to drop into your campaign.
Yeah.
And how much of it you choose to do, that's entirely up to you. But I have done it an awful lot. And to me, it's worked really well.
And if you don't know a ton about history, that's okay. There's a lot of people who are in that same boat, and there's some great places that you can start. If you're already here on YouTube, personal recommendations, this isn't both of us, this is just me. Go check out TED Ed. They're the same company that does TED Talks. They run a whole series where they talk about anime. They talk about different 5-minute things from history, and they animate the entire thing and give you an overall breakdown. Cool. Crash Course World History by Hank Green and his brother. They do the same kind of thing where they'll take a single subject about something historical and they'll talk about it. So if you have some question about the Etruscans, if you heard that word but don't know what it means, they'll probably have something where they're talking specifically about that, and they'll give you a good overarching breakdown.
And those are really popular.
Those are really good. Popular, yeah, very much so. If you have kids who are high school age, they've probably gone through and they've watched something along those lines. But then there's no end of books that you can find as well that aren't necessarily scholarly. There's so many resources out there that you can find to get things started.
And one of the other things that I will mention is that in a lot of cases, some of the cultures that I've taken, they might be cultures from the 1700s.
Yeah.
But I've just changed their trappings and dropped them into my what is essentially my medieval 1100s campaign.
Yeah.
At least in the area that you guys do your campaigning.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's just the stories of individuals themselves that you will be inspired by to drop into your campaign. It won't necessarily be an entire culture. It might be just individuals acting within that culture that you can drop in to give a little bit of flavor to your game.
The only limit, my friends, is your own imagination.
Very true.
So get out there and dream.
Anyway, I'm Jim.
I'm Alex.
Keep your sword on free.
Bye, guys.
Bye.